The courtroom buzzed with low chatter, fluorescent lights humming softly above. In the back row, a black man in a charcoal gray hoodie sat quietly, eyes fixed on the front. His presence didn't demand attention, at least not yet. Two officers leaned against the wall, whispering crude jokes under their breath. "Another one," one muttered. "Bet he can't even spell FBI." They chuckled, unaware of the irony brewing behind those tired, watchful eyes. What they didn't realize was that today justice wouldn't just be blind, it would be watching. And that man they mocked? He was the reason the court session even existed. Welcome to Swift Tale, where stories aren't just told, they're revealed. Today's tale is about silence, power, and the danger of judging someone by their skin before hearing their story. If you're joining us for the first time, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, because this isn't just content, it's reflection. And let me ask you this. What would you do if you were mocked in court by men who didn't know you ran the very institution that could end their careers? Think about that. Then lean in. This story will stay with you. The man in the hoodie hadn't come to court to plead innocence or guilt. He came to observe, to listen, to assess. Because behind that humble exterior was a man newly appointed as director of the FBI, and the courtroom he sat in had been flagged for misconduct. But he wanted to see it for himself, raw, unfiltered. No suits, no briefings. Just the system as it operated when no one important was watching. And the truth he witnessed? It wasn't just injustice, it was institutionalized arrogance dressed in a badge and uniform. The reason this story matters goes beyond the shock factor. It speaks to something much deeper, the assumptions we make when we see someone who doesn't look the part. Racism in uniforms. Mockery in courtrooms. And the deeply rooted belief that status or intelligence couldn't possibly reside in someone who walks in quietly wearing brown skin. But when the man they mocked rose to speak, when he pulled out credentials none of them saw coming, the entire room was forced to reckon with how dangerously wrong those assumptions were. This isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a mirror. A reflection of how far we still have to go. Because if even federal leaders can be mistaken for just another defendant based solely on appearance, what does that say for the millions without titles, badges, or public platforms? That courtroom moment shattered more than silence. It exposed a system too comfortable in its biases. It showed us what racism looks like when no one thinks they're being watched. And it showed us what accountability looks like when someone powerful chooses to remain silent, until it truly counts. So before we dive into what happened next, the smirks, the sudden silence, the unbelievable reveal, just remember, justice doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it's hidden beneath a hoodie, watching and waiting. And when it speaks, the room listens. Make sure you don't miss a moment of this powerful journey. Hit that like button, share this eye-opening tale, and subscribe to Swift Tale. Because in a world where appearances deceive, our stories reveal the truth. Let's uncover what happens when power walks into a courtroom unannounced, and turns the system upside down. The morning air outside the courthouse was cold, but the man in the hoodie didn't flinch. His pace was steady and his expression unreadable. To the world, he looked like an ordinary observer, maybe someone here to support a friend or relative in trouble. Inside, the courtroom doors swung open, and he took his seat quietly in the back row. His hands rested on his lap, thumbs tapping slowly, calmly. No one asked his name. No one asked why he was there. To the bailiff and officers present, he was just another face, one they thought they didn't need to respect. Detective Kramer leaned toward his partner, Officer Bell, nudging him with a smirk. Why do they always show up early? Like sitting through court's gonna earn them a medal. Bell didn't even glance up. Maybe he's waiting on his cousin's sentencing. Probably gonna cry when they give him 15. They chuckled, not loudly but loud enough. Other officers didn't laugh. Some shifted uncomfortably. They'd seen those two joke like this before. But nobody spoke up. No one challenged them. The culture of silence wrapped tightly around their racism like an invisible badge of immunity. And the man in the hoodie heard everything. He sat still, unmoving as if carved in stone. He didn't react. Didn't flinch. But beneath that calm surface, wheels were turning. The man had spent his entire life studying people like them, those who wore uniforms like armor and used silence like a shield. He didn't need to confront them now. He was here to see what the system looked like when it thought it was safe. When it believed no one powerful was watching. And this was exactly what he came to witness. Unchecked bias, emboldened by the courtroom's routine. The judge entered. A few nods followed. People rose. Proceedings began. Still no one looked at the man in the hoodie. Not once. He pulled out a worn notebook, black leather, soft from years of use. He didn't write at first, just listened. A young man stood before the court, a public defender by his side. Charges were read. Drug possession, resisting arrest. Standard fare. But as the prosecutor spoke, the director's pen finally moved. Not because of the charges, but because of the way the officer testified. Flat. Disinterested. And contradictory. The man scribbled a name, Officer Bell. When the body cam footage was played, the courtroom tensed. It showed Bell shouting, twisting the young man's wrist. The suspect's voice could be heard pleading, "I didn't do anything." But the clip cut off just before the fall. A technical error, they claimed. But the director knew that trick. He had seen it across too many departments. And now he was watching it play out in real time, with the very same officer who had mocked him minutes earlier. The room carried on as usual. But behind the scenes, history was being documented, by the very person they had dismissed. At one point, Bell glanced back, narrowing his eyes. Something about the man in the hoodie didn't sit right. He nudged Kramer again. "Who's that guy?" he whispered. Kramer squinted. "Nobody important. Probably some civil rights blogger." The comment was met with a smirk, but deep down, Bell felt a twinge of unease. There was something deliberate about how that man was watching. Not the anger of a relative. Not the sympathy of a citizen. It was something else. Something trained. But by then, the testimony was over, and the next case began, pulling attention away once more. Lunch break came. The director stepped outside but didn't go far. He watched as Bell and Kramer exited, laughing about something on Bell's phone. They walked right past him without acknowledgement. No salute. No nod. No recognition. He noted the irony. These men had sworn to protect and serve, but their behavior served only themselves. They didn't know who he was, and that was the point. In that ignorance, their true character had been exposed. Not just to him, but soon to everyone. Because what was recorded in his notebook wouldn't stay there for long. Inside the courtroom, whispers began. A court clerk, having seen the man's face somewhere before, pulled up her phone discreetly during recess. Her eyes widened. She whispered to the stenographer, who whispered to the bailiff. Rumors moved like shadows, silent but swift. Was it really him? The director? In this room? In that hoodie? But by the time they turned to look again, he was already gone, vanished into the hallway, blending in with the crowd. That's how he operated, invisible until he chose otherwise. And today he was building a case no courtroom could ignore. Back at headquarters, the man finally unzipped his hoodie. A crisp white shirt lay underneath. He straightened the collar and walked into his office, greeted by a respectful, "Good afternoon, Director." He nodded, setting the black notebook on his desk. "Get me internal affairs," he said calmly. "And pull the body cam archives on officers Kramer and Bell." His assistant didn't ask why, he didn't need to. The director's expression said it all. The next time those men stood in a courtroom, it wouldn't be as officers testifying, it would be as defendants. And the courtroom would remember the day it laughed at the wrong man. The trial resumed after lunch, and everyone returned to the courtroom expecting more of the same: arrogance from the officers, smug looks from their attorney, and silent composure from the man they believed was just another powerless defendant. But this time something had shifted. The courtroom's energy grew thick with anticipation when the defense attorney demanded the man state his full name and occupation for the record. The man calmly stood, looked directly at the jury, then turned toward the judge. "My name," he said in a measured voice, "is Jordan Elias Monroe. I serve as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A long, suffocating silence blanketed the room. One of the officers' smug grins slowly faded. The judge's pen dropped. The spectators' gasps echoed like a wave crashing into a cliffside. In that single moment, the courtroom's foundation cracked, not just from shock, but from guilt and realization. The people who had ridiculed him, dismissed him, and disrespected his dignity, now understood they had mocked not only a black man but the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country. The revelation rewired the mood entirely. Reporters who had shown up for an easy headline now scrambled for quotes, flipping open notepads with wide eyes. The prosecutor, who had previously treated Monroe with mild indifference, now addressed him with pronounced respect. "Director Monroe," she began, "given your position, why didn't you disclose your identity earlier?" His response was both simple and profound: "Because justice should not depend on who I am. It should stand on its own." His words hung in the air like a gavel striking at the core of every hidden bias present in that room. The officers who once laughed loudly, now sat stiff, the blood draining from their faces. One of them shifted nervously in his seat. The attorney for the defense attempted to raise an objection, but the judge quickly cut him off. The balance of power had shifted, not just legally but morally and symbolically. The trial was no longer about a fabricated charge. It had become a litmus test for accountability in the American justice system. Monroe's testimony was not angry, but it was thorough. He recalled every word, every insult, every false accusation hurled at him by the officers. But instead of emotional appeals, he presented data, highlighting not just his personal incident but a pattern of racial profiling that had plagued the department for years. His voice didn't waver, even when describing the moment one officer whispered to another that Monroe probably couldn't afford decent legal help. That officer's head lowered in shame as Monroe repeated the words aloud. The gallery behind him sat motionless, some in tears, others in a deep state of self-reflection. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It had transformed into a mirror, one showing the ugly face of institutional arrogance and the possibility of justice when someone stands firm against it. The judge, visibly shaken by the unfolding truth, asked Monroe if he wished to press federal charges. "The Department of Justice will handle what must be done," he replied. "But this trial isn't about vengeance. It's about change. It's about reminding every officer in this country, and every citizen watching, that no one is above the law and no one is beneath its protection." The court was silent, but the silence was no longer laced with mockery. It was filled with reckoning. A reckoning for every time someone had been silenced because of their skin, their background, or their title. The media coverage exploded within minutes, and the video clip of Monroe's statement went viral. In cities across the country, people shared the footage with a simple caption: "The most powerful man in the courtroom was the one they thought had no power." Outside the courthouse that evening, a crowd gathered, not in protest but in solidarity. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with activists. Children on parents' shoulders held up signs that read, "Respect is not optional." Monroe stepped out into the crowd, nodding in humble acknowledgement. He didn't wave like a politician, nor speak like a hero. He simply stood still, embodying what justice could look like when no one backs down in the face of injustice. The officers were taken into custody pending investigation. The court ordered a full review of their prior cases. And though Monroe returned to Washington the next day, his presence left a permanent imprint on that town, and on the conscience of a nation. The man they mocked had forced an entire system to look at itself. And now, it was time for change. News of director Jordan Elias Monroe's courtroom revelation spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, every major news network aired the footage of the trial's turning point. The image of Monroe calmly stating his title while wearing a modest black suit became the face of a national reckoning. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #DirectorMonroe, #JusticeBlindfolded, and #BlackandPowerful trended worldwide. Civil rights leaders took to the airwaves, not just to defend Monroe, but to amplify the significance of what had happened. "This wasn't just about one man," said one commentator on national television. "This was about every person who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or criminalized because of how they look." College students organized marches. Law students analyzed the court footage in lectures. Even public school curriculums adjusted overnight to include the incident as part of ongoing discussions on systemic bias and leadership. The courtroom wasn't just the epicenter of a trial, it had become the ground zero of a movement. And the man at the center? He wasn't asking for pity. He was demanding reform. In Washington, D.C., political pressure mounted. Congressional leaders, both Republican and Democrat, called for a federal investigation into the officers involved. President Raul Santiago, who had appointed Monroe to the FBI post 3 years earlier, issued a formal statement. "What happened in that courtroom is unacceptable." But Director Monroe's restraint, leadership, and courage remind us why he was chosen to lead one of our most vital institutions. Behind the scenes, several state attorneys general reviewed policies related to racial profiling and misuse of authority. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice moved swiftly, announcing not only charges against the offending officers but also a federal audit of police departments with the highest civilian complaints. The system, often slow to react, had been jolted awake. And while the response didn't erase years of injustice, it marked the beginning of something long overdue: accountability on a national scale. Monroe's silent defiance in that courtroom had triggered a legal tidal wave across the nation's justice infrastructure. Journalists from across the world requested interviews, but Monroe declined most of them. He wasn't interested in media glory. Instead, he returned to his desk at the Hoover Building and began drafting an internal review policy for FBI field offices, making sure no agent, no matter their rank or background, would experience what he did. He held a private meeting with the Attorney General and submitted a comprehensive proposal titled, Justice Without Title. In it, Monroe outlined a plan to train law enforcement officers on cultural literacy, implicit bias, and lawful conduct during civilian encounters. His goal wasn't to shame but to educate. We cannot discipline a nation into fairness, he wrote. But we can teach our institutions to reflect the dignity of those they serve. The proposal received widespread acclaim, and soon local departments from Florida to Oregon began adapting versions of the policy. Monroe didn't just want justice for himself, he wanted prevention for others. The fire had started in a courtroom, but now, it was spreading through policy halls, classrooms, and even neighborhood precincts. Meanwhile, the 3 officers involved in Monroe's wrongful arrest were officially indicted. Their mugshots made front-page news, a bitter irony for men who once saw themselves as untouchable. During their arraignment, they avoided eye contact with the cameras. One officer, visibly shaken, offered a tearful apology to Monroe's legal team, though the director declined to attend. In a public statement he explained, "Justice must be impartial, not driven by bitterness but by law. My presence is no longer needed in that courtroom." Instead, Monroe remained focused on rebuilding trust. He visited a youth detention center in Baltimore, speaking to a group of black teenagers about courage, identity, and perseverance. "I stood in court so that one day you won't have to," he told them. The visit, captured on a hidden cell phone camera, went viral. And for the first time in weeks, the nation saw him smile, not as an FBI director but as a man who still believed in the good of a broken system, and in the power of those rising within it. As protests turned into policy meetings and courtrooms turned into classrooms, one thing became clear: the system was evolving. Not perfectly, not easily, but undeniably. Monroe's ordeal had illuminated what many tried to deny for too long, that even the highest title means nothing in the face of unacknowledged prejudice. Yet from that revelation came action. Police unions were forced to revisit outdated disciplinary procedures. Judges received mandatory training on unconscious bias. Civil rights attorneys cited Monroe's trial in at least 5 landmark cases within 2 months. The man who had been mocked, silenced, and restrained now stood as a symbol, not of pain but of transformation. His name became a reference point for justice. And while the nation still had a long way to go, it had finally begun taking meaningful steps forward. In silence and dignity, Monroe had turned a courtroom insult into a national revolution, and he did it not by raising his voice, but by standing in his truth. Months after the courtroom incident, Director Jordan Elias Monroe stood before a packed auditorium at Howard University. Students, faculty, legal scholars, and journalists filled every seat, not to witness a scandal, but to hear from a man whose silence had spoken louder than most speeches. As he stepped to the podium, the applause lasted nearly a minute. He wore no FBI badge, no tie, just a charcoal suit and quiet confidence. "I didn't come here as Director Monroe," he began. "I came here as Jordan, the boy who grew up doubting his place in rooms like this, until he learned that his worth wasn't dependent on the people who underestimated him." The audience fell silent, hanging on every word. He talked about justice not as a destination but as a practice. About dignity not as something given by title, but something preserved through character. His words carried the weight of experience, not just of leading an institution, but of standing alone in the face of public humiliation, and choosing grace over retaliation. That day he wasn't just a federal official. He was a living testimony that truth doesn't always need to shout to be heard. In the months following his speech, Monroe launched the Equal Justice Initiative for Law and Legacy, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting accountability within law enforcement and legal education across underserved communities. It offered scholarships for Black and Brown law students, community workshops for officers, and traveling exhibitions focused on systemic reform. Monroe personally funded the program's first year, rejecting offers from political donors to keep it independent. Meanwhile, his story became a staple in university curriculums nationwide. Professors used the courtroom footage to spark debate on institutional perception and implicit bias. Artists painted murals of Monroe standing in court, arms behind his back, eyes calm but defiant. His presence, once dismissed, had now become a symbol of a broader truth. Justice must start with how we see each other. Through town halls, interviews, and quiet mentoring, he reshaped the conversation from victimhood to leadership. Monroe wasn't just repairing a moment, he was building a legacy not for himself, but for the generations coming behind him who needed to see that power could come with humility. One of the most striking images came not from the media but from a handwritten letter shared by a high school student named LaToya Jenkins. She posted a photo of her letter on social media with the caption, "He made me believe again." In her words, she confessed how her older brother had been wrongfully incarcerated the year before, and how she had given up hope in the system, until she saw Monroe stand tall in silence while being handcuffed. "You could have fought," she wrote. "But you waited. You let the truth walk into the room on its own. That gave me strength." The post went viral. Monroe, moved by the message, arranged to meet LaToya at her school in Atlanta. The two shared a quiet moment before a small group of students, no cameras, no press, just heart-to-heart conversation. That one act echoed farther than any headline. Monroe had unknowingly become a North Star for youth like LaToya, those navigating a world that often made them feel invisible, and now had a model for resistance rooted in wisdom, not rage. Despite mounting offers, Monroe declined all book deals, documentaries, and exclusive interviews. "The story's not mine alone," he told one interviewer. "It belongs to every kid who ever walked into a room and wasn't seen for who they are." He stayed on as director of the FBI, but restructured internal communications, field training, and recruitment standards to emphasize empathy, de-escalation, and cultural competence. Officers were now trained to see civilians not as threats, but as community partners. Promotions no longer prioritized aggressive metrics, but integrity and trustworthiness. Within a year, the Bureau saw a marked drop in civilian complaints and a rise in public approval, the highest since the early 2000s. But Monroe didn't boast. He walked through his offices daily, shaking hands, learning names, and encouraging young agents of color. "Lead with who you are," he would say. That became the unofficial motto of the agency under his tenure. In redefining what it meant to lead, Monroe didn't just change a policy, he changed a culture. And that culture began to ripple outward, beyond D.C., into America's heartbeat. In the end, it was never about the courtroom or even the handcuffs. It was about the moment a nation realized how quickly power can turn blind, and how quietly courage can restore sight. Monroe never wanted fame. But his journey became a story for the books, not as a tale of triumph over evil, but of calm resolve against ignorance. In schools, murals, laws, and quiet conversations, his presence endured. Not because he shouted, but because he endured, with clarity, dignity, and purpose. His name now stands alongside the greats, not because he was the first to face injustice, but because he made sure he wouldn't be the last to overcome it with honor. His legacy? It's not his title. It's the door he held open for others, wide enough for every underestimated voice to walk through, knowing that they too belong in every room, every court, and every story yet to be written.